Maybe we'll jump into it because I know we're a little behind schedule. But, so my title of my talk is Late Learn Phase Designs, which I define them as it's like the cusp before you go to that pivotal trial. But I think if I took all the faculty in this room and then some, and each of us gave talks on different designs that could occur during this phase, we'd all be here for a very long time. So that could be a whole course, right? I guess, my word of advice is that don't think that you have to be an expert in every design, because it's very few of us are experts. The way we become experts is by implementing the designs and learning from them and that. So, but in the same respect as clinical trialists and clinical trial biostatisticians, I do think it's important that we know of the designs and we know when to bring them to the table, right? We don't want to be like the guy who lost his keys. Okay, so the guy loses his keys and he's looking for them, and a policeman comes by and the police says, "Oh, I'll help you look for your keys," and they're looking for the keys underneath the street light. And finally the police officer says, "Well, where do you think you dropped your keys?" And the guy says, "Oh, I dropped them way over there." So we don't want to be that person that just looks at the light because it's the fancy new design that's on the market or something. There's all these other designs that really could help us, and the design is always going to be driven by the questions of the study. Okay, so the designs that I'm going to focus on today are ones that probably are usually left in the corners in the dark. Futility designs, I don't think enough people use them during this phase of moving, that go, no-go decision. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. All right, so we've already seen this several times today, just recently by Anna, but the clinical development, right? And in that phase 2, we know we're looking for tolerability and feasibility, and some of the designs that Anna gave to us will help us answer those questions. But we also have to think about that go, no-go decision. And this is where I think, and just from experience, that futility design really is a nice go, no-go decision. And it might not be in an adaptive setting, it might be in your traditional setting, but you still can implement the design in either setting, okay? So unfortunately, many of us have been in this position where we've worked with our collaborators on that early phase, whether you want to call it a phase 1 or just an early pilot study, and the results were booming, right? For whatever reason, things look fantastic and everyone gets excited. We all get, exacerbated by the thought of going through the grant review process, which can take several years. So they say, well, let's just jump to that phase 3. And we're just going to move to the pivotal study, and we'll make it an adaptive or group sequential, and we'll put in early stopping. But before we take that leap, and unfortunately, maybe I've become an expert in it because we've done it so many times, but we learned that maybe that leap was taken prematurely. And we can't forget the importance of the phase 2 studies. So we know in phase 3, I put generally requires larger because nowadays with the different designs, sometimes your phase 2 is going to be just as large as your phase 3, depending on what kind of questions you're going to answer. But in general, phase 3 studies are larger. They're multi-center, so they're obviously going to have a bigger infrastructure budget. And as I mentioned, right, just because you see something promising in that early phase, don't think that you're going to get a home run in your efficacy. We all know that because just as Bill mentioned, the success rate is very small once we get to that phase 3 pivotal setting, okay? And that's part of the reason why I believe that NIH has been putting in their funding announcements for clinical trials, that they want to know about what is your predefined go, no-go decision, right? What is going to make you move to that? Because in general, we all know clinical trials are expensive, and we really have to be getting it right sooner. And we don't need to be spending time in the pivotal setting on something that we could have sorted through earlier on, okay? So sounds a little odd, but we do want to fail faster, right? Earlier, I should say. And why are some of these early studies promising? We know that it's a selective study population very often when we're in the early phase. We kind of keep tight criteria on the eligibility, and then as we learn more, we loosen things up sometimes. They often are done in a small number of sites. I mean, just in my working group, we're talking about KO wards and these R21s that some of the clinicians are applying to, or applying for funding, and they are talking about, well, I can only do it, you know, I'm an early investigator, I can't be launching this multi-center clinical trial, and it's kind of true, in the early phases, a lot of times you're early in your career and you're doing smaller number of sites, 1, maybe 2, okay? Maybe you used historical controls and there really wasn't, there was bias in there, and that's why you're seeing promising results. And a lot of times in the early phases, maybe we're using those surrogate endpoints because we don't want to wait for survival, so we're going to look at biomarkers, or we're going to look at an earlier time point, and there might not be that true causal pathway, okay? So we all know in phase 2, what our goal is to be able to decide whether we proceed to phase 3 in terms of our outcome, right? In terms of being able to confirm or prove efficacy. But the thing to remember in phase 2 is there's so much more that as investigators in this area we're learning about, okay? So you're gonna learn about the tolerability, obviously, and maybe those dosing studies that you did, maybe they, you know, if there's only about 20, depending on what your sample size is, maybe that's not really giving you the full picture of what's tolerable or safe. So again, depending on what you have so far, maybe you need to do a phase 2 study before you go to that pivotal, right? Again, talking about the surrogate or true endpoints, we talked about endpoints earlier in the central room. Maybe you need to really hone in on what is the endpoint that you need to measure, right? It's associated with your intervention. In phase 2, this is a great opportunity for futility, okay? Which is what we'll talk about. But also there's that feasibility component. And I know at least in my group, we talked a lot about feasibility. And it was hard for the clinicians to really say, well, how can I write a grant that's talking about feasibility of doing a study? And I said, well, that's kind of what the phase 2 is, because we want to know before we get to that pivotal setting is, can we even enroll these patients, right? Can I maintain the blind? Will people consent to be in the study? Is it too costly for me to conduct the study? Those are all the questions you really want to answer before you get to the pivotal setting. And that's why this phase 2, if we think about a phase 1 being, what is the dose that I should be even exposing my patients to? Well, that doesn't necessarily answer all of these questions, so you might have an additional study in that phase 2 realm to conduct. So there's lots of things to consider before you go to that pivotal, right? Now, I guess the thing is, a lot of people will say, and I think someone mentioned, I had a question about it this morning in the sessions, was, well, what's the difference? Why can't you just build futility designs or futility stopping rules into your phase 3 design, right? And that is an option, but again, it goes back to, are you ready to embark on that phase 3 study? Because you have to write the grant for the confirmatory aspect of that study. You're going to budget for it as if it goes to the end, right? You have to go to the maximum amount of budget. So and sometimes you are ready for it, but not every scenario. I think it's really going to depend. There's no blanket statement. But if you can sit down with your collaborators and ask these questions, then you'll really know, depending on the responses, where you are in the development phase and what design should you be looking at as you go through this process of drug discovery, right? So if you're talking to your investigators and they're kind of like, well, I think it's going to work, I think people will be adherent to it, then you start, that's a clue right there, right? That you need to say, well, maybe we should think about some of these phase 2 designs versus thinking about the actual confirmation of efficacy, okay? Yes, you can gain experience with implementation in multiple sites. That's very true, but again, it's going to be depending on what your intervention. Is there a lot of variability? Or is it a simple intervention that anyone can get? Blinding procedures are very important. We're one of the folks in my group, we're working on pediatric migraine, and they're really trying to figure out if they could even, they're doing a lidocaine injection versus a saline injection. And one of her big questions is she doesn't even know if she can blind the population. but at least based on the CHAMP study results, I think the placebo rate was like 60%, or something like that. I know, in the CHAMP study. So blinding is very important. So before she kind of launches into any kind of confirmatory study, she's really going to have to answer the question, because I would think that the peer review would want to know whether she could even blind with lidocaine injections. So there's a lot of things to plan for before you go into that phase 3. Yeah. Oh no, please.
What is your experience like with review panels on some of these sorts of things? Because it feels like, it feels like it would. Some of them come back inconsistent with what they expect or don't expect from the reviews.
Do you have any specific examples?
No, but I mean, it's just like I have a hard time getting people to want to do feasibility for those types of things. They think of it more as, I don't know.
Who's going to fund me just to do a feasibility study? No, and we've had the same conversations, even just in our small groups. But I remind them that yes, you're getting reviewed on the science part, right? The scientific meaning and your whole theoretical model for why you think this intervention works. But we all know in clinical trials that a lot of results can be biased, and that's why we randomize, and that's why we blind people. But if you're finding out that you can't blind anyone and there's a huge placebo rate, that just dissolves your whole study. So you have to address it.
On the sort of broader sort of cultural NIH question. Mm-hmm. So NINDS they specifically have written into their exploratory trials RFA that they ban the use of phase 2 trials to estimate effect sizes. Because as we talked about, an effect size is something that's clinically meaningful. You may need to learn more about the variability in your clinical effect, but it specifically says if you submit a phase 2 trial that says we're trying to learn the effect size, it will be administratively withdrawn. It won't even go to reviewers. So if it's assuming they found it, but they would probably find it. Now, you can contrast that with a different NIH institute, which I think is the National Institute of Mental Health. And they specifically say that you should find an effect size of this. Their policy is your phase 2 trial should be an underpowered phase 3 trial. And we will pick the things from that to promote to the phase 3 trials. So when you get that, when people sort of give you pushback, it's like, well, we should just do an underpowered phase 3 trial because that's what everybody else does.
Yeah.
Statistically, you're professionals in this, maybe, and you just have to say that's not the right way to do it.
But also remember, the feasibility questions I'm talking about aren't we need to estimate what the effect is going to be, right? This is more, can you conduct the study? So your specific aims page for this type isn't going to be all about feasibility, because then you might want to do a different mechanism, right?
Well, that doesn't necessarily make sense. Like, you say you're pretty much going to do this trial, you get all this preliminary evidence, so you have done some things for it, but it's kind of making it so that you still need to find out. I think if the balance is you still need to find something out, but that you still know enough that you can do it and be successful at doing it.
Yeah, it's a fine line of promoting, or I guess trying to write a grant to do that, to make it look like it's not an underpowered phase 3 study, right? You have to have certain aims. But we've definitely done trials where they might be an R21 mechanism, where we're trying to test the feasibility of even doing this study, right? There's sometimes questions about the feasibility of being able to conduct the study.
I'll give a specific example. We're doing, NHLBI has a pilot studies mechanism for clinical trial planning grants, and they have all sorts of other mechanisms now for sort of early phase pilot protocol writing sort of mechanisms. One of the projects we had done here before was for a study of ECMO, which is like a heart lung machine for patients with cardiac arrest. Now, in the current state, if you have a cardiac arrest, most ambulances will try to bring you back to life. But if they can't they just sit there and try to bring you back to life. They don't bring you to the hospital because the paramedics have everything I have in the emergency department. They have a defibrillator, they have drugs, they have an IV, they have an airway. So they'll sit there and try to bring people back to life. And if they don't come back to life, then they're done, right? And that's okay. But the study is, can you change that procedure and say, put somebody, instead of doing that, bring somebody and put them on this really intense intervention and put them on a heart lung machine in the emergency department quickly before their brain is toast and still actually have a good neurological outcome. So the feasibility endpoints in that, one of them is, can we predict who we can actually get to the hospital within 30 minutes of the 911 call? And that's a feasibility outcome, right? So we have an algorithm that says, okay, this person comes in 911, did they get to the hospital in 30 minutes? Did they get to the hospital in 28 minutes? We have a prediction, and then did they get here, right? Time to hospital is one. Then the other sort of feasibility or sort of operational is, do we actually get them on this machine in less than 30 minutes after they hit the hospital? Because it's sort of complicated to hook somebody up to our lung machine, and we've trained emergency physicians like me to do it, and it's sort of crazy, but we do simulations, we can do it in like 15 minutes if we're on it. Now, we are not making, the reference outcome would be neurologically intact survival. In this study, we have randomization built in, but it's a question as to what randomization is giving you. But we need to know that in the future trial, we could actually randomize. So we do have 4-to-1 randomization in there, basically to show that if we tell the paramedics, this one you're taking to the hospital, in the event that this person doesn't respond immediately, because sometimes people aren't in cardiac arrest, where you shock them once and they come back right away. And those people aren't in the study, but if you do this randomization procedure, can you actually do this randomization procedure? That's sort of a sort of question. So that, again, you have to think about, but since the prior expectation is that 100% of these people are dead, we're not trying to estimate, if one of our 16 people survives, is that good? It's not necessarily good, but that's not the main study objective. The main study objective is, can we get the people to the hospital fast enough? Can we hook them up?
And so what is your go, no-go criteria based on the feasibility outcomes, or is it based on something else?
It's based on the feasibility outcomes. But I will tell you though, if if all 16 people in the intervention group die, there's not going to be much enthusiasm, for going forward. So
So a little bit of futility also tied in there.
Right. It also makes adverse event reporting weird, right? When we talk about what's an expected outcome for someone who's dead, right? It is dead. So the death was a pre-existing condition in these folks. So anyway, sorry to
No, it's
sidetrack
true.
us.
And there is, I guess a lot of it is also how you present it, right?
Yeah.
Do you call it a phase 2, or is it more this development phase? I mean, there's different, I think, grantsmanship ways, and it probably depends on which institute.
Yeah, well, since ours isn't a drug, we can just sort of say this is an exploratory pilot phase
But I think,
trial.
unfortunately, or fortunately, not all the institutes kind of go by the same viewpoint of what's going to get funded. So it is going to depend, and I know not all the projects coming out of course necessarily go to NINDS. Depends on the funding mechanism. So, but I think it's good to do your homework to really look close at the funding opportunity and make sure that you're not breaking any rules. But they're important questions to ask, because if you can't hook them up to the machine, or you find out no one's going to consent and we have a sham-controlled study, then why are you even trying to get this pivotal study funded?
Right, and there was another project we had where it was doing a different procedure on little babies with congenital hydrocephalus.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, it's a big question of when the doctors are going to say, I know what to do, are they going to randomize to one of two strategies, even if the other strategy would be better? It's how many parents are going to say, oh, just give me the thing we've been doing for the last 3 years, right? But the new thing might be better. So some people, is anybody even going to consent to put their teeny little kid into that sort of study? And the question is, do you even need a study where you're actually trying to randomize people, or you need some sort of qualitative work, focus group work to say what are the characteristics of families that would do this? And then if you have enough data to say, okay, these people would actually put their kids into this, then maybe you go forward with something. But it still becomes a question as to when it really comes down to the wire, you're going to do something quote unquote experimental to my kid, except for now the surgeons just do it and say it's better anyway without data. So
Well, hopefully the student, that was from, I forget her name, the student from last year.
Yeah, she moved to UCSF, so Kelly.
Yeah, Kelly.
Yeah, so I don't know where she's going with it, but we have to have a whole nother sort of idea about like that
Okay.
neuroprotection right into the brain definition.
Okay, back on track. So a couple phase 2 designs, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but I always think it's good to review them. So obviously we have the traditional designs that we'll go over. I'm going to introduce the futility designs in case you're not familiar with them, as well as some hybrid designs. And I put ... because like I said, there's so many different designs that could happen during this learning phase. And I'm not going to cover all of them, but just remember that there's a lot out there, okay? So what are some things when we're designing the study and we're in this learning phase, you still have the question of whether you're doing a single arm study, maybe you have good historical information. I know that's rare, but there are some diseases that have good historical information. Or maybe it's not historical information, maybe you're using the person as their own control. So there's a lot of phase 2 MS studies where the person serves as their own control, right? We're well aware of those. So you have to say, okay, well, first, am I doing a single arm or a multi-arm? Okay. Are you going to do a fixed sample trial at this stage, right? Or are you going to do a stage design where you say, well, I'm only moving forward if I see X, right? These predefined rules of whether you're going to move forward. There's nothing wrong with doing a fixed trial. You know, we hear so much about adaptive designs, and people get all worried and said, oh, I better propose this adaptive design. Now, I agree, at the pivotal stage, you should have some sort of interim analyses where you're going to stop the study early, whether that's for futility or overwhelming efficacy. It's going to depend on your clinical setting. But in these early phases, you don't always have to have some kind of mechanism, right? Safety trumps everything. We know that there's always going to be safety rules. But you might propose a fixed sample trial, and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? Or are you going to do the sequential? So those are kind of some of the key considerations no matter what design you choose, okay? So if we just did the single arm, single stage design, right? We have this historical control, P0, and we want to say, well, if I want to target response rate, so I want my PT or my proportion of successes in my treatment arm to be so much better, whatever A is, okay? From what my historical control is. And you can do a one-sided test, and you can say, well, I'm going, if I reject the null, then I have some preliminary evidence that my treatment's doing something, let's say. And I think it's worthy of moving forward. And you're going to choose your type 1 and 2 error rates. And again, in this middle phase setting, you have to think of the implications. Not everything is just 0.05, two-sided, right? I think that's kind of more when you get to the pivotal, you kind of hear more of that. But you do really have to think of the implications of what does it mean to have those false negatives and false positives. Maybe it's okay to have your alpha level of 0.1 at this stage. What are the risk benefits that you know so far, okay, about the study? So you still can set those, okay? But again, you really want to be aware of proposing a 2-arm, right, underpowered phase 3 study. And it could be a slippery slope. You really have to think about the outcomes. Maybe in this phase 2 setting, you're more focused on mechanisms and biomarkers, right? And as a secondary, you're going to be looking at efficacy. You have to think about what the outcomes are, but it is you don't want to use this mechanism just to gain some information about the estimate.
And just to point something out that we were talking about last night, you know, even though this is often sort of thought of in the frequentist paradigm, that P0 is prior, basically.
Right, you
So-
can think of it as prior. You can think of this, yes, I'm not going to distinguish between frequentist or Bayesian. They're both appropriate in the clinical trial setting. It's what you're comfortable with. And then,
But it's a prior assumption, so it has
right,
implications in terms of how this thing is going to work. So, you know,
very true.
I mean, I can decide a prior with the P0 as the single, you know, with a probability of 1. So I don't have to assign a distribution to it.
Yeah.
And then I'm back to the.
You could, it would be a very informative.
You're injecting a lot of.
I mean, I think the point is, just like Anna was talking about, you want to see what, if that assumption is wrong,
Yeah.
how does that change what your design would look like?
And that's in either setting.
Go
Yes.
back, it's not really quite that the P not is the prior in a sense of a prior, but it's like,
It's your perceived,
if you're wrong about your historical control rate,
then
you mess this up.
Right,
everybody's.
you don't, and you won't, in a single arm, you're not gonna know.
Right,
And it's like, every time it seems we do a double arm study, placebo just like does super great.
Blows away.
Like not 60, not necessarily 60% great, but like.
I know, right?
Sometimes.
And you do have to be
Keeps
careful about
getting
these
better.
single arm, single stage designs. And I think this is, at least historically, people got, they jumped the cliff too fast because they said, well, my single arm, I think my historical control rate is this, and look what my single arm's doing, when you find out there's just a ton of bias in the whole thing. So you do have to be careful about this. But I'm not going to say don't ever do these types of studies. It's going to depend on what you're asking, what stage you're in, and what are some of the issues of the clinical study.
Is there always a hypothesis testable? I mean, could you sometimes just estimate with a confidence interval and that's what my goal is?
Yes, you can definitely do that. I just showed a hypothesis testing framework, but you can just do estimation. Like a lot of times, non-inferiority studies usually are more in the pivotal, but those usually are estimations versus the hypothesis test. So yes, there's nothing wrong. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, what Chris mentioned this in his talk, I don't want to see the p-value at the end of the day. I want to see the effect with the confidence interval around it, right? The p-value is helpful, I'll take it, but don't just give me the p-values. So then there's the two-stage design, right? And Simon introduced this way back when, because he was saying that the single arm, right, single stage, you're going to waste a lot of patients when maybe you know the answer sooner. So he said, well, let's do an early look, and let's just take those, it's still single arm, okay, when he first introduced this. And we're going to look at them, and we're going to say, well, if the number of responses doesn't pass a certain threshold, well, then we might as well stop now before we enroll any patients, right? And there have been, since Simon introduced this, there have been several extensions to this. I just give you one of the references, which is even a relatively old reference now, but there are different optimal two-stage designs, and you still see them coming out. I still see them come across grant review, so they're not obsolete. So, but again, I just want to slide this in there. Is there are obviously limitations that we've already talked about, and so you have to be in the right setting to make sure that you're separating out the trial effects from what the true treatment effects are at this stage. Okay. So what might be a little better, so we're talking about futility designs. So futility designs, right, we want to get rid of the treatments that are least likely to demonstrate benefit, okay? So the features of a futility design, they're usually one-sided hypotheses, okay? Your formulation of the null hypothesis is split, right? So now, what are we trying to do? The null is saying that the treatment might have promise, but we never really can prove the null. So that's why our alternative is truly the futility, and we're trying to prove the futility, okay? They don't have to be one sample. You could do two samples. I'm going to give you some examples of different futility designs. But, and we actually, I say the royal we, I should say Sharon has definitely done her share of futility designs, and I believe even Jordan and Parkinson's, right? Have done the futility design. So you two can chime in when you want to.
I have a grand due tomorrow, can.
They can just whip that out, right? So again, let's just say P naught is the success rate, right? Whether it's a standard or it's placebo, whatever your setting is. And let's just say delta is that improvement considered clinically meaningful and not futile, okay? This, I think, is probably one of the difficult aspects of any design, right? To try to figure out what that clinically relevant effect is. But you have to have discussions with your clinical partners and your collaborators to really figure out, okay, what is that threshold where I know that it's not worth moving forward, okay? So then our target response rate, right? It has to be that success rate plus whatever that threshold is. It's got to be greater than that. And if I see something greater than that, then I'm not going to stop for futility. So there's our one-sided futility hypotheses. Again, remember that if we reject the null, then we're done, and we're not going to pursue any further studies with this treatment. The thing to point out when we talk about our type 1 and type 2 errors, right, because we're flipping the definitions of the null and alternative, right? So we know in our traditional efficacy what's alpha is our false positive, right? We're seeing ghost and beta is our false negative. Well, now in your futility study, it's just the reverse. So you really have to think about, right? Because if now my type 1 error is that I'm claiming futility when maybe it really wasn't fetal. And does that deserve a threshold type 1 error rate of 0.05? It might not, right? You really have to think, again, it goes to the risk benefit, the expense of the intervention. A lot of phase 2 futility studies, I've seen them conducted in an alpha of 0.1 coincided, okay? But regardless of whatever you choose, you're gonna have to justify it, right? So you might stick with the 0.05, might even make it more strict depending on what the risk benefit is, right? But then in another respect, our type 2 error here is that we're bringing that therapy forward to a pivotal study when we really should have never done that. So obviously we don't want that to be too high, those chances to be too high to have that false positive, okay? But just like in any of our studies, you just have to defend what your choice is. So this is an example of a single arm futility design that was done by the Parkinson's disease group, or NET-PD. And Barbara Tilley, who was actually chair of our department way back when, was the PI of the statistical center in Jordan, was also a statistician with NET-PD. So I think, and Barbara, I think, really pushed the futility design. She wrote a lot of statistical papers and clinical papers, just kind of bringing light to this as another alternative in your phase 2 setting. So this study was a study to test the futility of treating Parkinson's patients with an experimental drug, right? The goal is to reduce the number of patients who require levodopa, so to reduce the treatment failures. The historical data indicates that untreated patients would have a failure proportion of 42.5% after 12 months of follow-up. What the study team wanted to see was that the target treatment response rate had to be 32.5%. So that delta was, remember, they're reducing, right, the failure rate. So that delta was an absolute 10%. That's what they wanted to see. So you can set up your hypothesis testing, right? They chose a one-sided alpha at 0.1. The beta was set at 85% power, okay, or 15% chance of moving forward with an ineffective treatment. And you can calculate the sample size that's needed for this based on these parameters, right? So if you did a one-sided test for a binomial proportion, if they observed 42%, you obviously have a very small p-value and you would know not to move forward and you could claim futility, right? And that would be a very straightforward go, no-go decision and you're done, right? But what if you're doing your futility study and your treatment effect or your failure rate was actually only 14%, right? You would have to like hold the reins on your clinical investigators because they would be so excited that they say, oh my gosh, I have a home run, this is really working. But remember, just because, that's one of the things that you have to remind everyone, is just because you fail to reject in a futility setting, and you might see these treatment effect estimates, that doesn't mean you proved efficacy because your study design wasn't meant to prove efficacy. And again, it could be, this is a single arm study, there could be a lot of different things going on. So you just have to be careful that people don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, we've confirmed efficacy because we have this great effect size that we saw. So that would be one example of a single arm futility. Now, Sharon's been closely involved with a 2-arm futility design, and the study's actually still being conducted. We should hopefully be seeing results in the next year or so, probably. But Sharon's had the great experience of just going from the very beginning. So IDEF was actually first conducted with a dose finding, so a phase 1 study where they actually implemented the CRM procedure, similar to what Anna was talking about earlier. And so I give you the reference in case you want to see all the details about that. But then once they did their continual reassessment, their phase 1 study, they identified a dose, maybe doses, determining, what actually is the best one to move forward to that pivotal. So the next phase that they put in a grant for was to actually test for futility before they go any further, okay? So they're testing the futility of treating ICA patients with an experimental drug, naproxamine. The goal is to increase the number of patients who have a 90-day MRS of 0 true, so we're looking at treatment success. They did have historical data in this population, but they knew that it was potentially unreliable. So this is why they're doing the 2-arm futility study. And Sharon has a nice paper on the design. I provide the references at the end of the slides. But in summary, the investigators, so they have a placebo arm success rate. They're assuming it to be 28%. Okay. And that minimally clinically important difference, that delta, is going to be set at 12% for their futility threshold. As far as the error rates, they chose a one-sided alpha of 0.1 and a beta of 0.2 or 80% power. And Sharon, remind me of your total sample size for this
It was
study.
324.
It's been 324. Just to give you an idea of the size of it. And the goal was to, so this was done under, I guess back then, was it an RO1 mechanism or a UO1?
I think it's a UO1.
I think it's a UO1, so yeah, they might have changed it over to a clinical trials, but they got funding to do this futility study under a UO1, and then this would be their go, no-go decision, and then they would apply for funding for the actual pivotal study. So that's the plan. We'll see what happens. So again, but these are good papers if you want to look at some of the design features. So I guess in general, the futility designs, I think they are a useful design type to identify those ineffective therapies when you know you're not ready to propose this pivotal study setting, okay? Don't forget about those error rates. I think a lot of people just automatically assume they have to be 0.05 and 0.1 or whatever, but you really do have some flexibility as long as you can justify it. But the other thing with futility designs I want to talk about is they could be used in combination with other designs, okay? You don't just have to do this futility design. So I'm going to talk a little bit about selection designs, which are different than the dose finding that Anna talked about. And again, just something to keep in your toolbox. So there's randomized selection designs, say they're phase 2 studies. Part of that is because it's not necessarily that you're proving this is the best dose, you're just picking what looks like the best dose, right? So you're selecting, you might have multiple doses, you might have multiple treatments, it's going to depend on whatever you're examining, and you want to figure out what is the best treatment that I should be moving forward to the pivotal stage, okay? Your randomized selection design does not necessarily have to have a control arm. Again, it's going to be depending on the questions you're trying to answer before going to the pivotal setting, but you could do it with a control arm or just have these active arms, and you're going to choose which one's looking best. There is no, as I mentioned, there's no formal hypothesis testing, so we're not worried about those error rates. Okay, but you do have to predefine your selection procedure. And the way you predefine it, you just want to have a high probability of selecting the superior dose. Okay, you don't want to make any errors in that dose selection. Once again, Simon throws a simple selection design. So if you have, he wants to select the best of K treatments to take forward to phase 3. The sample size estimated, you want to ensure that if the best treatment is superior by at least some amount, so you're going to have to specify what D is, okay, then it will be selected with high probability. If you have 2 treatment arms that kind of are close in their performance, that's going to lower your probability of correcting, picking the best one, right? So when you look into these types of studies, you're probably still going to do some sort of simulation or examples to say, okay, well, what if my doses look like this, or what if my treatments look like this? What is the probability, and what should my sample size be? Okay, so but with most of the designs now, you're looking at what could happen, and using those operating characteristics to pick what's the best assumptions to make in the design of the study. Okay. The criticism to these designs is that it is somewhat arbitrary, right? So you're going to have to really support your assumptions about this and why you're choosing this design. And there have been, these were proposed a while back. the literature has extensions to these methods. A lot of dissertations have come out of extensions to these methods. So do your homework, look at the literature if you decide to do these. But it is kind of, you see selection designs that then it could be like a seamless design. Once you select your dose, then you go into your futility study, right? And I have an example of a study that actually did just that, this hybrid design. And this was an ALS trial done a few years ago. And so basically with the ALS study, what they wanted to do is they had 2 doses, they didn't know which one to move forward with. So they said, well, let's do the dose selection, but they were still not in the pivotal phase yet. And then they morphed it with the futility.
So one thing I wanted to, with the selection designs, you shouldn't have, what we said, placebo arm at all.
No, you can have either. You can have a placebo arm. It's not required, but you still could have a placebo arm. I think it's going to depend on why you need the placebo arm. Now, if you're going to morph it into another study where you might be testing for futility and it's a 2-arm futility, you're going to want to start with a placebo arm because you're going to want to use the subjects from stage 1 and stage 2. So that would be an example of where you might want to include the placebo arm. Okay? But again, it's going to depend on what your study design is.
And there may be certain external things that won't absolutely require you to have a placebo. Like for something that had, like we do stroke studies, death, right? Like death is hard to you're not going to tell somebody like, oh, you were in the, we did this single arm study and you got a drug, so you're not going to die. That's implausible. There's like large placebo responsive pain studies, for example. So if you're doing a study with a pain outcome, you may have an external scientific reason to strongly favor having a placebo control. So that, sometimes, in some of the cancer designs, they have a tumor, right? Sometimes you can will tumors to shrink, but biologically we don't think that happens too often. We think chemotherapy tends to shrink tumors. So you have to also, this is we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow about how you should interrogate your clinician when they're doing these, when you're coming up to these designs.
Yeah.
But you want to get some sense of the disease as to, because one of the sort of hallmarks is, a blinded assessment of the outcome. And, the gold standard is if you have a placebo-controlled design, the necessity for that may be contextual based on the underlying condition. Cardiac arrest, again, people probably are going to be dead. It's going to be hard to talk people out of death. Placebo doesn't tend to prevent death, but for other designs, you have to think about it.
Yeah. And the selection, so if you just took the simple selection design and don't think about a hybrid design, I have to admit, I don't know if it's published anywhere, but if someone did a head-to-head comparison with like a continual reassessment and a selection design to pick your dose, I think you're going to get better results with the continual reassessment method, right? Because there you're doing a dose finding. Personally, where I would probably use the selection design is if I did my dose finding study and I truly still had a question about these 2 doses that might have looked relatively similar in their performance, whether that's safety, versus efficacy, then maybe I would say, well, I have these 2 or 3 doses that all kind of look the same, but I'm still not sure, especially with the balance of the risk-benefit. I might do a hybrid design where I would do the selection, do that part in the stage 1, pick the dose then, and then move forward to whatever my next question is. So I wouldn't just use a selection design just to find dose finding necessarily. Okay. So let's go to the Levy study, which was for ALS. So they ended up having a control plus 2 doses of active treatment. So in the first stage, they want to pick out of those 2 active doses, but they're still going to enroll in the control arm because they know they need the control arm for this final analysis. So the stage 1 is going to have 105 and they're equally randomized, okay, to the 3 arms. Once they do their dose selection, okay, which is basically based on which dose is performing better, okay, quantitatively, then stage 2 rolls in and then they're only randomizing to the control of the chosen dose. So they just have an additional 80 patients, okay? But in the final analysis, they were going to use the information from both stages, okay? So 75 patients per group. Their primary outcome was changed from baseline in the 9-month functional rating scale, which I think is a common outcome for ALS studies. So let's see, so they designed the study for the stage 1, designed to have a probability of 80% for selecting the correct dose between the two. If the doses are gonna, they put a rule in there that if the doses looked like they were actually equal, then the choice was gonna be determined by safety and cost. So I think that's a good, you never know when the doses are gonna end up, so it's good to think about this before and try to pre-specify as much as possible, okay? So that was their stage 1 decisions. And then they went into the futility, okay? And they did have to put some assumptions on this. What did they assume was going to be the decline in the placebo arm? So based on prior information or previous data, it was 8.5%. They had a standard deviation from that. Their futility threshold for this was the 20% relative to placebo. Okay, so that was their futility threshold. They chose a one-sided alpha 0.1 and a 80% power for the futility aspect of this. There's a really nice write-up. There's 2 papers actually on this coenzyme Q. It's the actual study, and then Bruce Levy wrote the design paper as well, and I gave you both those references. So you can imagine, and this is what goes back to my statement that I made in the beginning, there's so many different ways you could design a trial, and the best thing to do is to fill your toolbox, right? And you're only going to really become an expert by doing it, but at least that's why we collaborate, right? None of us are experts by ourselves. It takes a collaboration, and you just want to make sure that you know where to go, right, to find the right answer. But again, it's going to be based on the questions. I can't say that enough. You really got to follow what questions. And even though maybe your collaborators are thinking it's one question, when you start discussing, it ends up being a totally different question that they really need to answer for that efficacy question. And yes, it's true that, we hear about these different fancy, or some will say fancy designs versus the traditional fixed. And some people get a little worried that, are we going to be able to do this? Is it going to be too much complexities, or because it's going to cost too much? Yes, there's probably going to be increased complexities, but that's why there's NIH supports these types of training programs. That's why we have grants out there to support the planning of these. So don't be discouraged, or don't let your collaborators be discouraged. There's ways, if it's the right design to answer the question, then that's what you should be pursuing. And peer review should also understand that. Okay, so just a couple, closing statements. Just in that phase 2, don't forget that you may or may not need a control. Okay, I think in neurology a lot of times you need a control. I don't know of too many where you don't need a control. Like I said, maybe MS, but they're like an internal control. So lots of things that you think about. But the one thing that I didn't mention yet is that rate of recruitment and length of follow-up. That phase 2 design, because it's not that underpowered phase 3, you might want to think about surrogate endpoints, right? You might want to, if there, I don't know of many disease areas that have good biomarkers. So I think maybe that's going to come in the future, hopefully. They're doing a lot of biomarker studies. But there's other surrogate, maybe short-term outcomes, right? Because you're not trying to prove efficacy. You just want to say what's going to help me move forward. But you do have to think about how long it's going to take to recruit patients, and those are the feasibility aspects. So make sure that everyone considers that in this phase 2. Thank you. And I'll put references at the end.
So, just one question.
Yeah, please.
Have you used futility design with in-between lookups before? So,
In the pivotal study, or
any study where you are have in-between looks and then deciding whether it's futile to move to the next?
so when we have our interim look, so a lot of our pivotal studies will have, almost all of them have interim analyses, where we might make the decision to stop for overwhelming efficacy. But since there's so much to learn, overwhelming efficacy stops are usually more rare, but stopping for futility in those pivotal studies, we include, definitely. And it's a little different than just your standalone futility
Right.
study.
Exactly.
you know, a lot of the stopping rules and things, it's gonna be based on what your beliefs are, but in a frequency setting, we still look at Pocock and O'Brien Fleming stopping bounds and things of that nature. So, but yeah, I always include them. I think, do you guys pretty much?
In the phase 3.
In the phase 3.
Well, I think for NINDS.
We have to, yeah,
utility
NINDS you have to,
in the
but
phase
again,
3.
not every institute.
Yeah.
We work with a lot of different institutes, and it's gonna depend.
So
It seems very
O'Brien,
unusual to have a phase 3 trial without at least one interim look for each.
Well, there might be an interim look, but some, you know, some won't
Don't
do
have
futility.
formalized rules.
They might just do efficacy, or they might, so it depends.
so O'Brien, Flemings and Pococks are symmetric boundaries.
Right, and you might not choose, so you might decide, like sometimes I might want to be more aggressive in futility, so I might choose like a Pocock boundary, but my efficacy is going to be O'Brien Fleming. They don't have to be the same boundary depending on what you're looking at. You can't mix it, you know, or maybe you'll do a conditional power
Okay.
versus,
And sometimes it brings up sort of interesting post hoc ethical issues, right? When it's like there's 10,000 patient trial for some condition that has nothing, and the P is like 0.000001, and you're like, they could have got there.
Right.
5,000 patients, like what were they doing? But sometimes it may be it may be so controversial, the finding is so controversial to the existing medical knowledge that they feel like that it was worth it to randomize those other 5,000 patients. And sometimes you look at those things, and you're like, how did they not have a rule in? And then the flip side of that is, then there's persistent criticisms that all the trials that are stopping early are providing sort of biased estimates of the treatment effects, which they probably are to a certain degree, but are they getting the answer incorrect? In that it's pretty unlikely that treatment isn't effective. It's fairly unlikely it's as effective as observed, but it's not, it's pretty likely, it's still extremely likely that it's more effective than what it was being compared to. It's just that estimate of treatment effect. There's a whole, I'm not even gonna get into that.
yeah.
That's
And there's a
that's
lot of
nuts.
times where your DSMB, remember their guidelines, and they might overrule it and say, we're not stopping right now. You might have crossed that boundary, but we're not. So I've definitely been in that situation where the DSMB's just said, there's too much other stuff going on, and we want to ride this out.
So one question, going to the effect or efficacy. So at the interim look, we have the boundaries and we have the p-values, and based on those p-values, we're comparing with respect to those boundaries. But it's irrespective of whatever effect we observe. So if the effect is, say, large, and I'm not able to actually frame the question. But
Well, I think though it is tied, obviously, right, the p-value, if you're designing your study correctly, the sample size is appropriate so
Right.
that you're not getting spurious test results because
Exactly.
of the large sample size.
got it.
So then when you do look at your interim data, whether you're doing a predicted probability or you're using the group sequential approach, it is tied into the treatment effect. You know, most people don't have the luxury, the money to be able to do those big studies where you're going to have enough sample size to make it significant.
And sometimes you have to be careful in terms of things that are versus placebo, like drug treatments. You sometimes are going to go in two-sided efficacy rules, but that whole zone, like a trial going on because it might be on the way to proving that placebo is superior to the treatment, unless that's, like for example, the SHINE trial where it's two sort of medically usable treatments,
Right.
intensive control versus non-intensive control of insulin. Then actually having that, the ability to go into the sort of standard group and show that that's superior to the new thing may be helpful.
Right.
But if it's a placebo-controlled study for
Right.
ALS, finding that the new thing is beating placebo, something to think about in advance, like, you probably don't want to prove that. And the DSMB usually is going to pick that up, but
But sometimes they don't pick it up until your second interim analysis. So you might
You might be doing it.
you might think about it if you can up front, because it's annoying to have it brought up later.
Yes, that's true. So lots of different scenarios.
Thank you.
Still going?
I know,
Yeah.
I know.
Sorry.